Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first virtual web fiction convention. We're starting small, but yeah, we have some great names here, very, very experienced and high-profile authors, and of course, the star of the show, Drew Gilmore. Yeah, so our first panel will be with David Verburg, also ErraticErrata. He's been an author for at least 7 years, which is around, correct me if I'm wrong, around when the serialization of A Practical Guide to Evil began. Massive, massive work of quality, clocking in at, I think, over 3 million words, which is
thereabouts.
quite an accomplishment. So congratulations on wrapping that up and more recently beginning your new story, Pale Lights. How are you doing today, David?
Pretty good. You?
I'm good. I've been very excited to plan this whole thing and finally excited to get this on the road and kind of celebrate afterwards. Yeah. So how's your writing schedule been looking like since Practical Guide to Evil? And I know you took a very long break, I think for
Yeah.
6 months, something like that.
Yeah, 6 months.
6 months.
Basically the last update of Practical Guide and first update of Pale Lights, I gave myself 6 months, which wasn't really a 6 month vacation. There was quite a bit of writing in between, but I did get a healthy break.
Awesome.
So yeah. No, that was my writing schedule nowadays is it depends. I mean, I have something for Practical Guide that I can't really talk about right now, I think. That I'd say it takes maybe a day or two a week. The rest is preparing for the Pale Lights update and editing and a bunch of other stuff. But I would say at the very least 3-4 days writing for each chapter, which is much slower than it was for Practical Guide at the end of it. But I'm not quite as familiar with the setting yet, so it takes more effort to get stuff out.
Yeah, awesome. I definitely noticed that the world building, there's a lot more dense and rich world building in the beginning of Pale Lights. I'm not saying, Practical Guide to Evil does its fair share of world building and history.
Yeah.
I think we all are familiar with, or for readers of your work, we're all familiar with and love the little tidbits in the beginning that delve into, the adventures of dread emperors and empresses and whatnot, heroic axioms. Um, but yeah, so one of the questions that I've been wanting to ask you was, what kind of lessons might have you learned from writing for so long, writing Practical Guide to Evil for so long? What lessons have you learned there that you're now trying to carry on into Pale Lights?
Mm. Keep much better track of all the lore that you put down. There's no such thing as in passing, especially if I like to plant hints early for stuff that goes on later. And I started writing Practical Guides like as a teenager, like the very first version of it that was called Black and White. And there was some lore that was only in notes for that I ended up using like 5 years later. And it was a labyrinth of notes to go through from like different eras of my life, different books. I actually found like when I was writing book 7, something I wrote when I was 19, like an entire book of notes that I scribbled when I was traveling with my parents, I think. And yeah, I ended up using some of it, but yeah, I kind of wish I had that when I went back in book 4, maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, keeping notes, I wouldn't call that necessarily advice. But for me, I almost never work in the house because my productivity tanks. So find a coffee place that's open late and has a decent speed of internet.
Mm.
Writing advice, I guess if you're going to be writing on the internet, have thick skin because people can get pretty bruising when they're anonymous.
That's certainly true. Certainly true. So would your advice then to be just kind of ignore, do you read the comments or?
I most of the time I read comments. Sometimes I go through the communities. I don't think it's necessarily too healthy to do that too regularly because you get too into the part of the fan base that talks to you, which isn't necessarily most people that are reading your stuff. But also there are some fan spaces that can get pretty negative. I've been lucky for that, but even for Guide, there were a few. I'd say be proud of what you're writing in the first place, because if you aren't, you shouldn't be doing this. At the point, if you believe in what you're putting out, it's much easier to ignore the noise.
Is that is that actually one of the reasons that you host your work on separate websites, away from other platforms, for example, that might have communities that come with their benefits and cons?
When I started writing guide, I had no idea places like Royal Road, for example, existed.
Right.
Like all the writing platforms that were mostly for fan fiction, and like I guess your example in the business is kind of Worm. And Worm is actually one of the things that got me written, because I told myself, oh, this is potentially something that can work. And Worm was on a WordPress, and I mean, I didn't think I was necessarily gonna make a living off Practical Guy when I started, so keeping it on my own platform made sense, I guess. Like later on, I already had people coming to my site, so I never really saw a point in moving to a Roll Road or something of the sort.
I see how wrong you were, right?
Yeah.
Or and fantastically, but yeah, I'm very very happy that I get to read all this work for free. And I'm sure you've improved. The daily. A lot of people wait for your chapters. I'm sure. Regarding your stories, another submitted question comes to mind, and one of them, I think is regarding the vast cast of characters that you have in your stories, and you represent a lot of things like sexuality, or even with Practical Guide to Evil, like being on the spectrum, for example, I think with Masego perhaps. And could you explain a little bit more about your thought process with how you represent these sexualities and different mental conditions?
I mean, for example, the LGBTQ stuff has been, I guess, one of the two foundational conversations I had with friends that drove me to write Practical Guide to Evil. Like this is one with a good friend of mine where we ragged about how a villain's plan could literally never work from inception, and he said it. The other was with a friend of mine who loves fantasy as well. She's a woman, pansexual, and she was super into a couple of books that I never even heard of. And I asked her why those in particular instead of like more famous fantasy stuff. And she told me, well, these are some of the only books in fantasy where I actually feel represented. And so I guess going in, I kind of wanted to, not necessarily a tribute to her, but it was something I was aware of, that if I could do it, why not? And I think it enriches the world as well, to just not everybody is in that very narrow, like white, straight, same kind of sort of like vaguely wasp morals. So yeah, it's definitely something I did on purpose. And I mean, I realized also that sometimes I kind of missed the mark on that. So it's something I look forward to correcting in Pale Lights and also in future edited versions of the guide.
Awesome. Thank you very much for giving the context. But I think you've done a great job so far. Speaking as so I've been on and off struggling with like mild bipolar disorder sometimes. So I'm not saying maybe it'd be fun one day to see a bipolar character. But yeah, I think yeah, thank you very much for that. And so I'm just actually going to pull up some questions because I did want to get some of the submitted questions in during the panel. Oh, and this one might be a good one. But how much behind the scenes work do you do? And so, for example, with Practical Guide to Evil, there's a lot of war. And I think Drew and I have had a conversation that he's mentioned you read a lot about like the Roman Empire and its wars and battles, but
And
also like all the
yeah,
different languages. And how do you keep?
if
Yeah,
if I could show you my library right now, but yeah, I mean, I had an interest in war tactics, strategy, all that stuff before I started writing the guide. I guess it's one of the reasons the guide turned out what it did. But usually, when I would get to like the major showpiece of a battle, like Second Lies or in the early books, or Princess Graveyard later on for guides. Usually I would sit down and try to look at something that historically speaking made sense considering the forces involved. And I mean, it's stuff I enjoy reading in the first place. I might have done it for pure pleasure anyways. But yeah, no, I have definitely bought history books that I did not think I would end up buying when I started writing the series.
Yeah, I think that kind of also goes back into what you were saying before about like being proud of what you're working or writing. And I think a lot of authors do this where they incorporate experiences from out of their as out of experiences aside from being a writer. So, for example, I think scientists or engineers tend to have a very mechanical way of developing their magic systems, hint, hint, inadvisably compelled. Um, but also, and again, discussing Royal Road, there's a story on there, like, I became a biologist in another world about, and yeah. But for you, I think that your passions align very well with, as you said, history and warfare and tactics, and dare I say, a fair bit of, maybe not Machiavellian tactics, but Amadeus, for example, being one of the most brutal, cold-hearted, logical, analytical characters that I've ever read, and it's done so well. And you know what they say about authors is, the characters and the plots are only as smart, or
Yeah.
those kinds of things as
Well,
the author.
I wouldn't say there's a lot of myself in Black
Mm-hmm.
Amadeus. I mean, he's I guess technically his very ancestor as a character is something I used to write in RP forums on the internet, and that character went through like 7 versions, ended up being what Black is, with honestly a lot of the redeemable parts stripped out and replaced by more ruthlessness.
I see. Do you consult others on plot points or plot twists, or how this character might think, especially considering you have such a vast array of characters that are all very unique?
Uh, Honestly, not that much. I have 2 friends I bounce ideas off of. One who is more descriptive, whether he'll like it or not. One I used to like sit down at the beginning of a book, and like I would have the outline for the book more or less in a sheet of paper. We'd sit down at a Starbucks for 2 hours and talk about it. Like, does this work? Does this not work? Does this make sense? But I didn't end up doing that for the later books because, well, he moved in a city pretty far from where I live. But for pure character work, it's very rare that I will consult someone else.
Mm. And so these friends or consultants, have you been working with them pretty much since the first time you began writing, or because you
Oh,
mentioned
I mean,
influences?
we've been friends since I think one of them 16, the other 17. Like they knew me back when I was writing like early Pale Lights, and it was basically a shitty fanfic in a kind of fantasy setting with characters that were very transparently our friend group. So
Mm.
yeah, no, they've seen the ups and downs of my journey to write. Let's put it that way.
Kind of going back into, and this is maybe something I maybe should have started with, but what was it like growing up in Canada? And what were some, as a future writer, in the context of being a future writer, and what were some of like books that you mentioned Warm, but maybe some more of the traditional books that might have influenced your current works?
Uh, I mean, a big influence on early Particle Guide to Evil was Soon I Will Be Invincible by Austin Grossman, which delightful book. Can't recommend it enough. I mean, there's actually a scene with Cat in book 2 that indirectly references a moment in it. And it was about superhero stuff, not, it was a deconstruction of basically a superhero, more partially from the villain side, partially from the heroic side of that kind of setting, and that was a major influence for sure because it was the kind of book I wanted to write, more or less. It also like gave me the delusion that, oh, I can knock this if I knock this out in 2-3 books. I don't need to do
Mm.
an entire series about this. Like, this is the easy project before I get to the difficult project.
Mm.
So, which obviously completely delusional, but yeah. I mean, I read a lot of fantasy, but I guess Marathon Book of the Fallen was also an influence. I wouldn't say that I drew a lot of it from them plot wise or even lore-wise all that much, but it was the level of complexity and world building that I kind of wanted to emulate. I guess I've read a lot of fantasy at some point, even if you don't consciously like draw on something for inspiration, it seeps into the back of your mind. Like sometimes sometimes there's only so many names when you write something. So at some point, like I was using Circle of Thorns for spy ring, and like in the comments they were saying, oh, it's very clear your reference to this other web serial that was using a similar name for something else, and I never read that, but there's some overlap when you do fantasy, whether you like it or not.
Right. So yeah, and were you one of those kids that like had their nose buried in books as a very young kid, or did you
Yeah.
discover your love
Uh,
at a later age?
I mean, I went to school at a place that was you had to cross a bridge. Montreal is an island, and I was in a part of Montreal. I lived outside of Montreal, and I went to school in Montreal. So understandably, that bridge clogged. Basically, it's a hellscape in the morning. Everybody gets stuck for an hour and a half. And my parents, well, they were very anti-screen, still are to this day. So if I wanted to do something in a car for an hour and a half, I got given books, and they were very good about buying books whenever I ran out of them. So I guess I stuck in that early because they started me on that when I was first grade, so 6, 7 years old. And they've always encouraged me to read. So yeah, very much book in my nose. I guess I fell into sports a little later, more when I was a teenager. But yeah, no, my childhood was very. I like to read. It's. I'm glad they gave me that habit as well. I think it pays off in a lot of ways when you're older.
Was writing something you envisioned yourself doing? So did you study writing in school, or?
I started university-wise in. I ended in creative writing, and I started in political science.
I see.
I actually wanted to be a lawyer when I was younger, and then I had a good look at what those courses actually entailed, and no,
Yeah.
I say this with affection, no, but I could not do that.
At least one of us is a lawyer here, which we very much need. Cool. Thank you. Is there anything else you wanted to cover? We have about 5 more minutes or a few more minutes, and then we'll take some live questions from the panelists, or I'm sorry, the attendees.
I'm not sure if I should. I mean, go and read Pale Lights if you haven't. It's pretty good. Starting 10 chapters public. Aside from that, I guess I'm still very grateful for the reception by the fans, and the fact that the Discord for Practical Guide to Evil is still active, even like more than 6 months since it's been over. It's been a blast to write a series, and I'm not quite done with it yet. There's still stuff to come, so I guess keep an eye open for that.
Sounds good. If the attendees, you guys can find a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. I believe you can submit questions through there for Erratic. And if you guys are having issues for some reason, please feel free to drop a message for us on the chat. That would work as well. Oh, we have a first question. What are some audience reactions to Practical Guide that surprised you?
I guess Kairos got a lot more popular than I thought he would, and Cordelia got a lot more hate than I thought she would. Because a lot of the time she would do stuff that, morally speaking, was very similar to Black, and she would not be liked for it the way he has been. Yeah, that. No, those were I guess the big surprises. Anaxares as well. Did not expect to get as popular as he did. Like early on, he was very much meant to be like a point of view character that allowed us to get a look at what Kairos was up to. But no, I was surprised by how quickly people took to him.
So I think, yeah, Kairos was definitely super eccentric, and yeah, I also loved him very much as a. Do you think that, and another question, do you think that there are any benefits of web serial publishing style, so weekly serialization or however many days, compared to writing it all out at once? So the advantages or benefits?
I think you can kind of see how audience reaction goes down. That can be an asset. It can be a downside also. Like it can kind of by pressure bully you out of what would be a good choice. But you can also see something if something like goes very, very badly over with the audience. I would say that for me, at least, it was much easier to keep motivated. It's one of the reasons I started doing a web serial in the first place, weekly to week to week, having a deadline, having people who expected a chapter to come out. It was my main block before I started writing publicly that I had a problem getting the stuff out, or I would do chapter 7 before chapter 3, and I liked what I wrote, but it wasn't really a book so much as like a collection of small bits set in a universe.
So the next question, and it seems I saw that chat has been disabled for attendees, so I apologize. We'll get that fixed, try to get that fixed during the 5-minute interlude. But another question for you is, how did you originally see Catherine and Warlord meeting? It says Warlords. I think that's referring to Hakram, maybe, meeting for the first time.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Uh, hmm.
As in,
So also so I'll fiddle with the functions, and maybe Literalian can flesh out the question, and we'll get back to it afterwards. And after this panel, feel free to hang around and type answers, or just keep it short. And I did see a previous Discord interview, so very long, 42 pages. So the answer might be on that as well. Okay, so that's about it. So we'll go through the rest of the questions if Erratic feels like typing short answers during the other panels. But I think for my adrenaline rush, we'll take a short 5-minute break and meet back here in 5 minutes. So thank you, everybody.